I moved to Hong Kong 7 years ago, and always been very impressed by the efficiency here in Hong Kong and the professionalism of the institutions like TDC organizing these kind of events. So honored to be here. And Dr. Xie already gave a very good speech about the One Belt, One Road initiative, many interesting charts. And I'll look at it from a little bit different angle. I guess it's more of a maybe a little bit of a sort of a geopolitical angle, if you like. Now, to be honest, I mean, 2 years ago, if you ask me about the issue of an initiative like a One Belt, One Road, I would be a bit skeptical because I've been following China for quite many years, and there have been a lot of initiatives from the central authorities. Some have been more successful than others. So that when this idea first came out, I think it was a bit, it's a big idea, but it's hard to figure out exactly what it means. Now, I think in the past year, I've been convinced more about the significance of this initiative. And for a couple of reasons. I would say the first reason being that I think there's a very good economic rationale why this happened. So this is a study that we did that in a report just recently issued. So I go through a few findings that from this report. I personally got quite a bit surprised, even though I worked on China for many years. But after this project, actually, I started to recognize the importance of China for many other countries, and from at least a trade channel. So bear with me to show you a little bit of statistics. The purpose of that research project is to find out globally, every country in the world, how dependent are they on China through trade channels. So for instance, Korea, if you look at Korea, their export to China is much more than their exports to the US, right? You can say the same for Japan, for most of the Asian countries. But on the other hand, some other people would argue that doesn't count because China imports say memory chips from Korea, then package it and sell to the rest of the world. So really, how important is China for as a consumer for final demand, right? So for all the consumer goods exported to China. So that's the question we want to figure out. And the reason why we go into this is investors being asking us in the world today, say a policy change in China, depreciation in August, only 4% depreciation, but if you look around the world, such a big impact, right? Brazil, Malaysia, even Dow Jones dropped by more than 12%. So why there's a global repercussion? Is that just people reacting, or is there an economic rationale behind it? Or if China really slows down or really depreciate, which country will suffer and who will be relatively safe? So that's the motivation. So we started by looking at sort of economic importance of China. So this bubble chart shows you the size of the bubble is the size of GDP, and this is 2000, right? The year of 2000, and we only show the G7 and the BRICS countries, and so China was small, right? I wouldn't say tiny, but it's comparable to Canada, and it's way smaller than Japan. And the two directions, the two axes, represents the share of global trade and global FDI, right? So back then, obviously, in the economic universe, there's only one center, and that is the US, right? And everybody else is way smaller. Now, so this is China. This is the world in 2014. So China is still smaller than the US, but you can tell that, I mean, it's become, in terms of the size of the bubble, it becomes, I mean, I would say comparable, right? And it's also remarkable to look at Japan. What a huge difference it happened over the past 14 years. And another interesting issue is not, other than the size of the bubble, is the share in global FDI flows and trade flows, right? So on that dimension, China is actually comparable. In terms of FDI flow, actually China became even bigger than the US, become the #1 recipients of FDI inflows. So then the big question is, I guess, bilaterally, who depends more on China than the U.S. Hold on a second, let me. So this is 2005. So the color of the map shows, so blue countries depend more on US as export market, and the red ones depend more on China, right? So this is 2005. So US was obviously more important. It's also interesting to see that outside Asia, only a few countries are red, right? So depend more on the China as export market. So for instance, in Africa, this is Sudan, this is Mali, in Middle East, Iran, and Australia obviously back then was a commodity exporter. And then in the Western Hemisphere, interestingly, only Cuba, right? So back then it was more driven, I think the trade direction was more driven by political issues. Now let's look at, this is 2014. So the world becomes much more balanced in terms of trade flows. And let me zoom into some of the regions, right? So this is Europe, 2005 versus 2014, right? And back in 2005, Europe was predominantly U.S. tilted, U.S. dependent, whereas nowadays, continental Europe becomes rather neutral, if you like. So we show some market shares here. So for instance, Germany, the market share, about 6% of its exports went to China, and 7% went to U.S. And similar kind of balance in France. UK is still U.S. dependent, but if you compare with 2005, the difference, the gap became much smaller. This is Africa. So more countries actually depend on China than the U.S. So this echoes quite well with what Dr. Xie presented about this One Road, One Belt initiative. Why there is a reach over to Africa. This is Asia, East Asia and Oceania, and what's striking here, so I got a bit surprised when I look at the chart. I mean, I wasn't surprised China, back in 2005, the region was very much dependent on US. There's a lot of blue countries. But I'm surprised in 2014, the region is actually not as dependent on China as I thought, right? So pretty much, if you look at Japan still depends more on US. Korea, ASEAN countries, most of the ASEAN countries depend just on China, as much as on China as on US. So if I borrow a word from the US election campaign, this is kind of like a battle stage, right? So these are kind of in the middle, not really dependent on one market versus another. But Vietnam stands out. So interestingly, Vietnam nowadays depend even more on US than 2005. So interesting implications. If you think about the TPP, the US initiative about a return to Asia, it's quite interesting dynamics happening. But there's a trade angle, there's an economic angle why that's happening. So this is a Middle East and Central South Asia. This part is interesting, right? So it has become, in 2014, kind of a balanced, and China built a huge predominance, sort of dominant position in Central Asia, right? So this is related to the One Belt, One Road initiative, right? So that One Belt, One Road essentially is coming with China and Europe on both ends, and the corridor is Central Asia. So when I looked into the trade linkage here, I started to recognize there's a rationale. I mean, why the One Belt, One Road initiative was launched. I think the China position in that region is probably underappreciated. Now, also interesting to look at Middle East, so this is, for instance, Turkey, the China-U.S. position become relatively neutral. Iraq nowadays export more to China than the U.S. And another interesting is in South Asia, say for instance, I got surprised that when I saw Pakistan, it's a blue state, it's blue country, right? So, but it's becoming less blue than 2005. So with this One Road, One Belt initiative, I can imagine that with port getting built over here, the trade linkage between China and this region will probably get strengthened. This is South America, and it's quite interesting to see that even country like Argentina nowadays export more to China than to the U.S. So that's the report. There's more in that report. I wouldn't go into more details, but I think this part is probably most relevant for the topic that we want to discuss. And so what I want to, the inference we want to draw from here is, number one, I think there's a good economic rationale why that China want to push this initiative globally, right? So compared with the previous leaders, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, I think the current leaders, they have a sort of they take a more proactive approach on the international issues, so that this expansion of infrastructure projects globally, I think there's a economic rationale behind it. So in that sense, it's not just throwing money over to wasteful projects. I think there is a sort of a data supporting this initiative. The second issue is, I think it's becoming more of a global initiative. So it's not. I wouldn't say this is just about the Silk Road. It's actually a global initiative. So if you think about AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I don't think it's an Asia bank. I think about it as kind of like a World Bank, right? So it's a global investment bank, because nowadays we have Brazil, we have South Africa, right? So we have a lot of pretty much all the regions in this map getting represented there. So that down the road, all these projects will be sort of spread it out. And 5 years down the road, I would consider the potential of AIIB similar to World Bank. I wouldn't benchmark it against ADB, for instance, right? So this is a global sort of initiative, but the focus, I think we probably will hear more projects, solid projects in Asia, and I would say probably in this region, so in the East Asia and this region, sort of South Asia, Central Asia, because these areas are the focus of basically, particularly I would say in East Asia, where the Chinese trade influence and the U.S. trade influence kind of balanced. And there's a lot of initiative that pushing trade in this region. For instance, TPP as one example, and then we recently saw the approval of the free trade agreement between China and Korea, and looks like the Chinese authorities are actively pushing for more trade agreement in this region with ASEAN countries. So this development here, I think, will be very interesting. You probably noticed the high-speed railway development in Thailand. In Indonesia, and down the road, I think there will be probably more countries getting involved in those projects. So I would say it's a global initiative with the focus in Asia, and then from a sort of a forward-looking perspective, what do we expect? I think the success of the initiative depends on two things. One is on financing. Financing is very critical for these long-term projects. That's where the AIIB becomes a critical institution. Because we take the Thailand high-speed railway project as one example. This still ongoing negotiation with China and Thailand. I understand one key demand from the Thai side is cheaper financing. And that's difficult. It's a bit difficult from China's perspective, because China financing is probably offered from, say, China Development Bank, whose funding cost is in mainland China, and the funding cost is relatively high. In terms of competition, take Japan's case as an example. Japan's financing cost is very low, right? So that's where the AIIB probably comes in handy. That AIIB is an international organization. You can think of the probably will be rated AAA, and in terms of funding cost, it's going to be quite low, right? So it's a super sovereign. So that on that front, I think it will help to promote the infrastructure projects in this region. And on that front, I think Hong Kong can probably play some role, because given the status of the international financial center, the development of infrastructure-related financing, particularly in the bond market, I think that would be something interesting to look at. I think that's part of the factor that will determine how successful this initiative will be. It's about financing. It's a pretty critical part of the plan. And from that perspective, I think the AIIB getting set up, widely supported, I think that's a very successful first step. And then the other issue is, I think, the collaboration between China and Europe. Because AIIB, if you look at the major funding partners, the European countries have pretty big voting rights there. And with this kind of a global operation, just like the World Bank, governance is going to be an issue. And how successful and collaboratively the European countries and China can work on this regard, I think that's a key issue driving the outlook of the projects in these regions. But on both fronts, I'm quite positive. I would say my outlook on this initiative has become more positive over the year. And I think if we think about this issue, you also need to consider in the context AIIB, this One Road, One Belt project, and the SDR inclusion, which has just happened last night. And probably the importance of these projects, or this initiative, is not just about individual projects, which port they build, which road it take. I think it goes probably beyond it. It looks like a more sort of a national strategy that has been built up, and it's just not just empty words, as I said, sort of supported by the development in the economic fundamentals. And now the government taking a very proactive role in both China and Europe. So I think this is going to be a very big deal. I think 2 years down the road, we'll probably see a wave of infrastructure investment, particularly in Asia region, could potentially spread into the other key areas like Brazil and South Africa. So maybe let me stop here. Yeah, thank you.